The Little Lava Lake triple homicide unfolded in the vicinity of Little Lava Lake within the Deschutes National Forest, situated in Deschutes County, Oregon, during January of 1924. The victims were Edward Nickols, aged 50, Roy Williams, aged 35, and Dewey Morris, aged 25, all of whom were working as fur trappers in the Deschutes National Forest throughout the winter of 1923 to 1924. Their bodies were not discovered until April of 1924, submerged beneath the icy surface of Little Lava Lake. The three men had suffered a combination of gunshot wounds and severe blunt force trauma. Although law enforcement had identified a potential suspect, no one was ever successfully prosecuted. Edward Nickols, Roy Wilson, and Dewey Morris were all residents of Bend, Oregon, who had made plans to spend the winter of 1923 to 1924 in a log cabin owned by a local logging contractor, Edward Logan, to work as fur trappers in the wilderness. Roy Wilson and Dewey Morris were working as loggers for the Brooks Sclannon Company and were experienced outdoorsmen. In the winters, their friend, Edward Nickols, would become the caretaker for a lakeside cabin at Little Lava Lake, Oregon. The three decided to work the winter as fur trappers in order to provide for themselves when they were not logging. In exchange for a place to stay that winter, the three men agreed to care for the 5 valuable foxes cabin owner Edward Logan had been raising for fur on his property. The arrangement worked well for everyone involved. The men moved into the cabin in the fall of 1923. At the time, the little remote lakeside cabin they were to stay at was situated in a sprawling expanse of forbidding, icy wilderness, far from civilization, with no roads and surrounded by a sea of trees and steep mountain passes. It would have been a formidable endeavor for most, but these men were loggers by trade, seasoned outdoorsmen who were right at home in such a harsh place. The week before Christmas, one of the trappers, Edward Nickols, aged 50, visited Bend, reportedly in a jovial mood, and sold a sled full of expensive furs. He told locals that the fur trapping had been going well for the men. After Christmas, Alan Wilcoxon, a resort owner, was traveling by snowshoe from his home in Fall River to his resort at Elk Lake. He stopped at a cabin to visit the three men. Alan arrived on January 15th in the year of 1924 and spent the night there. According to Alan, the three men were in good spirits and had been successful in their trapping endeavor. On the morning of January 16th, he departed the cabin for Elk Lake. This was the last known sighting of the three men before their death. Dewey Morris's brother, Owen Morris, and Pearl Lyons, superintendent of the Tamalo Fish Hatchery, became suspicious after not having any communication with any of the three men since that December. After noticing that mink traps set in the area had been left unmaintained in April of 1924, a search team traveled to the cabin but found no sign of the men. Inside the cabin, burnt food was in pots, and the stove and the dining table had been set for a meal. Whatever happened, it must have happened suddenly and unexpectedly. Traps, food, winter clothing, and rifles were all found abandoned in the cabin, and there were no signs of a struggle. According to some sources, a cat, starving but still alive, was found inside of the cabin. The search team estimated that the animal had been trapped in the cabin for a few months at that point. Outside, the sled used for the transport of goods and equipment was missing, and a fox pen behind the cabin that contained 5 valuable foxes owned by the owner of the cabin, Edward Logan, was empty. A blood-stained claw hammer was found in the corner of that pen. The search team checked on the men's trapping lines and discovered the frozen remains of 12 marten, 4 foxes, and 1 skunk, suggesting that their traps in the surrounding forest had been unattended to. The following day, Deschutes County Sheriff Clarence Adams arrived at the cabin to begin an investigation. Near the shore of Big Lago Lake, the searchers found the men's large sled, which was marked with dark stains that were later confirmed to be blood. On the edge of the lake, a hole had visibly been cut and frozen over. Nearby, on a trail leading to the lake, a searcher discovered pools of blood in the snow, as well as clumps of hair and a human tooth, as well as an expertly skinned bodies of 5 valuable foxes. Dewey Morris's brother Owen and Sheriff Clarence Adams explored the lake by boat. They discovered the bodies of all 3 men, which had floated to the surface of the lake. Post-mortem examinations uncovered that the 3 individuals had suffered gunshot injuries coupled with blunt force trauma, which were probably inflicted by a hammer. Roy Wilson had sustained gunshot wounds to his right shoulder and the back of his head. Edward Nickols still had his glasses on, the ones he used for reading. He had his jawbone shattered by a shotgun blast. In addition, he had a bullet hole in his head, possibly from a revolver. Dewey Morris had been shot in the left forearm and had also suffered a skull fracture, possibly caused by a hammer. A published report in April of 1924 indicated that law enforcement believed that at least 2 of the victims had not been murdered in close proximity to the cabin, but had been lured away from it. Initially, the police had their suspicions focused on an individual named Indian Erickson, a woodsman and moonshiner who had a camp nearby. However, Mr. Erickson was cleared by the police after providing a solid alibi. Owner of the cabin, Edward Logan, provided police with a potential suspect shortly after the men's bodies were discovered. Edward Logan suspected a fellow trapper named Lee Collins may have had something to do with the men's murders, because Lee Collins had a heated argument with one of the murder victims, Edward Nickols, the previous summer over a dispute over a wallet that Collins had allegedly stolen from Nickols. Lee Collins had spent the previous winter at the cabin helping Edward Nickols tend to the fox farm. At the end of their partnership, the fur markets were at a low point, and the fox farm's owner, Edward Logan, decided to wait to sell the furs until prices were better. Lee Collins, who of course wanted his money immediately, interpreted this as an attempt by Nickols and the owner to cheat him out of his share. So when he happened to know where Nickols had $500 stashed near the cabin, he stole it and disappeared. After the argument, Lee Collins had apparently threatened to come back and kill Edward Nickols the previous year. Cabin owner Edward Logan also had a run-in with Collins. Collins had stolen one of Logan's expensive fur coats and reportedly made several threats against him as well. Police were able to connect the dots and uncover that Lee Collins was actually a man named Charles Kimzey, who had been arrested in 1923 for robbery and attempted murder in Bend, Oregon, in which he threw a stagecoach driver down a well, but the driver survived and Charles was subsequently imprisoned. According to some sources, at that time Charles Kimzey had recently escaped from the Idaho State Penitentiary, where he had been serving a 14-year sentence. Charles Kimzey was also a skilled outdoorsman and was capable of avoiding capture. Charles's motive to kill one of the 3 victims, Edward Nickols, was clear. Allegedly, Edward Nickols had previously reported him for stealing his wallet. Charles apparently knew that Nickols reported him and developed a grudge against him. Charles Kimzey would know exactly where to find Nickols that winter, since the cabin and fox farm hadn't gone anywhere. Plus, if he waited to take his revenge until the dead of winter, he'd be able to also steal the fox pelts, valued at around $1,800, plus whatever else Nickols might have found on his strapline that winter. More circumstantial evidence came to light when a traffic officer in Portland recognized Charles Kimzey as a man who had approached him on January 24th, 1924, carrying a large bag and asking for directions to a fur dealer in the city. The officer directed him to Schumacher Fur Company on 3rd Street in Northwest Portland. where the man sold the sack of furs to owner Carl Schumacher for $110. After being approached by police, Carl Schumacher looked through his records and found a transaction with the seller noted as Ed Nickols. It had been on January 22nd, just a week after Alan Wilcoxon had seen the trappers alive. Whoever sold the furs had used the Nickols trapper's license and was the man responsible for the triple killing. Charles Kimsey had gone fugitive at this time and was thought to be hiding out in the wilderness, not hard to do considering he was an experienced outdoorsman. For years, police hunted Kimsey down, as occasional sightings of the wanted man were reported, but they were unsuccessful in ever finding him until on February 17, 1933, 9 years after the murders, Charles Kimsey was spotted in Kalispell, Montana, and was apprehended by police and returned to Oregon for questioning in the Lava Lake murders. When questioned by police, he gave an alibi that he was working in Colorado on building the Moffat Tunnel, a railroad and water tunnel that cuts through the Continental Divide in the north central Colorado. He claimed to have never heard of the three men or their death. According to some sources, Charles Kimsey's employment with Moffat Tunnel was actually confirmed. At this point, police had only circumstantial evidence against Charles Kimsey because the fur dealer, Carl Schumacher, who had purchased the furs in January of 1924, 9 years later, could not positively identify the man as Charles Kimsey. Nevertheless, Charles Kimsey was charged in the 1923 attempted murder of a stagecoach driver and sentenced to life imprisonment in the Oregon State Penitentiary. In spite of the circumstantial evidence suggesting Charles Kimsey's involvement in the Lava Lake murders, the case remains officially unsolved. Police considered that the three men had been lured away from their cabin as they were preparing for their meal, most likely breakfast, after which they had been overpowered by and killed by one or more armed perpetrators and then taken using a hand sled to haul their bodies to Little Lava Lake and dumped through the hole in the ice. Crime author Melanie Tupper claimed in her 2013 book The Trapper Murders that Charles Kimsey had an accomplice. Melanie Tupper believes that a man named Ray Jackson Van Buren was Kimsey's partner in the murders. Ray Jackson Van Buren had been linked to possibly a dozen unsolved murders throughout the state of Oregon, but no proof have been found to legitimize Tupper's claims. Van Buren killed himself in 1938, 5 years after Kimsey was captured, leaving any proof of taking part in the Lava Lake murders to the grave. The case remains unsolved and is one of the oldest unsolved murder cases in the history of Oregon State. What happened and who killed the three trappers in the cabin in 1924 will remain an unsolved case. The real murderer could have been hiding in the woods unseen, or blended in among the residents of Bend, Oregon. So the Lava Lake murders, have you ever heard about this case before?
No, not at all.
What are your first thoughts?
Whoever killed those three men seemed to have hatred towards them, because it seemed like he was making sure that he or she was making sure that they're all dead. Like, for example, Roy had a gunshot wound to his right shoulder and the back of his head, and then Edward had his jawbone shattered by a shotgun, and then lastly Dewey shot in the left forearm and the skull fractured. It seems like whoever was the killer was making sure they're all dead.
Yeah, and I guess it's also worth mentioning that the men possibly had died separately. They were lured away from the cabin.
Mm-hmm.
And remember that detail about how there was burnt food inside of the cabin?
Yeah.
That suggests that something abrupt happened. I think when they looked at what kind of food was burnt there, I think they determined that it was breakfast.
Mm-hmm.
And they were able to kind of somehow ascertained that they left abruptly, really quickly, for some reason.
Could it possibly be they heard a gunshot outside and they panicked and went to check it out?
Yeah, I can definitely see that happening. That's actually a very good thought. Most people suspect that Charles Kimsey is the most likely suspect, despite his alibi, which apparently checked out. Believe it or not, from the sources that I've looked into, apparently he did actually go to work in Colorado on that tunnel for a train. So there is this big mountain,
Yeah.
and they were digging a tunnel for a railroad.
What was the proof? Someone
Well,
vouched for him?
Maybe he had some sort of employment documents.
I mean, it's easy to forge them.
Yeah, that is true. It's not the most difficult thing in the world.
Yeah,
but,
well, it was 9 years after.
But you know why I think that he actually did go to Colorado? Because it's such a, specific alibi. It's so specific. Because Colorado and the tunnel that he was allegedly working on is nowhere near a Little Lava Lake. It's I would say hundreds of miles away, and it's a very specific location. So I think he probably was working there. I would probably bet that he was. So in the 1920s, he could have actually pretty easily made the trip to Oregon and back to Colorado in a week or less, especially since he had been trapping with one of the victims, Nickols, before, and likely knew the best time and place to find him. So that's the logic behind people thinking that he was actually able to make that trip.
And he had a feud with one of them, right?
He had a feud with this man, Edward Nickols, because Edward Nickols and Charles Kimzey, they were both working together on that cabin, but a year prior. They were tending to the owner's foxes that he was raising them, and then he would have killed them, the foxes, and sold their pelts because apparently they were expensive. So he was working with one of the victims, but at the time when Edward Nickols was working with him, he thought that this Charles Kimsey was actually a man named Lee Collins. And only after he reported that his wallet was stolen by Lee Collins, that's when maybe the law enforcement informed him that this man is actually a wanted fugitive.
I see.
Yeah, so we have that going on in this case. It is also likely that Charles Kimsey was able to leave without arousing enough suspicion if he had killed the three men for it to be noted in his work records due to the short amount of time he was gone, and because the work done on the Moffat Tunnel at the time was the Pioneer Tunnel rather than the main construction phase. Not really certain what this is all about, because these are just this is just some information that I found online, and I'm trying to kind of figure this out. So apparently, potentially, he was on leave in the tunnel works, but he didn't leave for a long time. So maybe he had, had enough time to go back to Oregon.
Quick in and out.
In and out. And it's also possible that Kimsey, who was also spending a lot of time in Oregon, had gotten word from some of his Oregon buddies about Nickols' recent haul before Christmas, which sparked his decision to commit the murder. Because think about it, just before Christmas, that same Edward Nickols guy, he went to Bend, Oregon. Bend is basically the 6th largest city in Oregon. It's a pretty big city. And he went there and he kind of boasted about that they were having a good time trapping that year, and they were going to make some good money. So I think there was a chance that maybe Charles Kimsey was actually tipped off by one of his pals back in Oregon that the men are having a good time trapping there, so he may have decided on the spot to go and pay them a visit.
Were there any foxes missing? Was it a robbery per se?
The foxes were missing, yes. So remember the foxes? There were 5 of them, and the 3 men were supposed to take care of them. But when the search team arrived to the cabin, the fox pen was already empty. But then later on, they found 5 skinned foxes. The skin was removed. And remember, a police officer in Portland on January 24th, so around, I would say, 8 days after the men were last seen alive, went up to the police officer and asked him where I could find the closest fur dealer. And then that police officer identified that was Charles Kimzey. So it's believed that Charles Kimzey, sometime between the 16th of January and 24th of January, killed the men, took the pelts, and went to Portland to sell the pelts. The only problem with this inquiry is that the man who was working in the fur store, Carl Schumacher, he could not identify Charles Kimzey. He wasn't certain that was the same guy. But this was 9 years later when they asked him, because Charles...
9 years is too long.
Exactly, and apparently Charles even went bald at that time, 9 years later. But Carl Schumacher stated that it was too much of a risk to potentially put an innocent man behind bars for a crime that he had not done, so he did not positively identify this man.
Yeah, but 9 years is way too long to identify one of the customers you had.
Exactly, it makes,
no sense.
No sense. So I think he did the right decision by not identifying. But I could see how Charles definitely was the customer.
Yeah, I think so.
So another line of thinking that some people I've seen thrown out there is that there is a potential suspicion, or like, let's put it this way, chance that Alan Wilcoxon could have been a culprit.
Who is he again?
He is the guy who stopped by the cabin on the 15th of January and spent the night there with the 3 men and left in the morning. He was basically just traveling through the general area by snowshoe, and he was a resort owner. And so he stopped by at the resort place. Oh, sorry, not the resort place, at the cabin, what am I saying? And then he had the conversation with the men. So he is the last person who has seen them alive.
Was he just a resort owner?
He was a resort owner. From all of the sources that I've read, no one really put any suspicion towards him. So I think most likely he has been cleared, but the reason why I'm bringing him up is that it hasn't been officially stated that he was ruled out. So Alex Wilcoxon, the suspicion why he could potentially be involved is that it was strange, I guess, to some people that he was using snowshoe in the first place to travel along those wooded areas, because there were probably a better way to travel. And another thing is that if this was just a common occurrence, why didn't he notice something was off sooner in relation to the trappers? And why I mean this is that, okay, he passed the cabin on the 15th of January, spent the night there and left by the 16th of January. But the men were only found murdered on April. So if this guy had a regular route between his home and his resort, and in between his home and his resort is the cabin, then wouldn't it make sense for him to kind of make a regular visit, or at least notice that something's off? Because let's remember that the men's traps have been unattended to. There was dead animals already trapped inside and frozen over. And it's just a bit strange, I guess, that this man, Alex Wilcoxon didn't report anything, but we don't know. Maybe he was living the entire time in his resort.
Maybe he dropped by once and he saw some animals still alive. Whoever killed those 3 men was a hunter, or at least know
outdoorsman.
Know how to skin an animal, a fox, know how to shoot a gun. And it seems like this guy doesn't seem to be an outdoor person. I don't know, if I was there, I would casually walk, I wouldn't know the difference.
That is a good point. I think everyone was a little bit outdoorsy back in the day in Oregon. I mean, that's the only... I mean, if you're gonna do snowshoe travel, you probably know a thing or two about winter survival regardless. But I think there is a good chance that maybe this Alan Wilcoxon was essentially just a man living in his resort, potentially.
Yeah.
And he did not ever make the trip back. And maybe if he did, then he would have reported something a little earlier.
Yeah, that's true.
Now, do you remember when I was kind of briefly mentioning the true crime author, Melanie Tupper? And she claimed in her 2013 book that she wrote about this particular murder, and I think she wrote about other murders in the Oregon state. In her book, The Trapper Murders, she suspects that Charles Kimzey actually had a accomplice in this murder who is Ray Jackson Van Buren. So Ray Jackson Van Buren is essentially, they call him the Angel of Death.
How come?
In Oregon. Because he is essentially linked to so many murders. And in every single murder or disappearance or when something bad happens, he is a witness. And he helps the
How
police.
very convenient.
Exactly. So I have a couple of his, or not even a couple, he's linked to like over 10, but I have like 6 cases. And I want to read them here because I think they're fascinating. And I was generally really interested in this Ray Jackson Van Buren. He really does seem like he's the angel of death in Oregon. It's pretty bizarre. So it all started, I believe, with the murder of John Creed Cohn, which happened on March 4th, 1904. So this is happening quite a bit before the Lava Lake murders, like 20 years earlier. John Creed Cohn was a prominent Silver Lake merchant and owner of a mule team freight line. He disappeared on a frosty morning while going to fetch the mail for his store. 7 weeks later, after an extensive manhunt, his well-preserved body was found staged on Little Hillock on a nearby cattle ranch. But there is an apparent attempt to suggest one of the ranch's cowboys had done it. Before planting the body, the killer beat the face to unrecognizability and shot it a second time using an old Colt .38 revolver. He'd stolen from Cohn's store, well, the perpetrator. So, follow me here. The coroner's jury, apparently concerned to protect the cattle ranch from bad publicity, ruled this man's clear murder a suicide. This was difficult for people to believe, given how difficult it would be to shoot yourself twice with a single action revolver and then beat your face to a bloody pulp. It's essentially a murder. There's no way it was a suicide. Other circumstances were also suspicious because this man, Cohn, at the time of his death was trying to figure out what had happened to the proceeds of a $3,000 loan missing from his bank account. This missing money was never found, and Cohn's brother had to pay the loan off with the proceeds of his liquidated estate. So what is happening here is that this man, John Creed Cohn, he's like a local businessman, and someone took a bank loan in his name. And then he found out that this loan was taken from his bank, but he didn't take the loan. And now the bank is asking for the money back. So he's thinking, I never took the loan. So he's trying to figure out who took the loan in his name. Now, school teacher Ray Jackson Van Buren, ate breakfast with this man on the morning of his murder and was the last person to have spoken with him conveniently. As an important witness to Cohn's last activities, he provided key testimony to law enforcement on what he said and where he went after breakfast, and gave detailed information for newspaper stories. So schoolteacher Ray Jackson also knew about the $3,000 loan which Mr. Cohn had taken out, allegedly. And Jackson was a convicted forger. So some speculate that Ray Jackson could have forged a $3,000 note or a promissory note to the bank in the name of Mr. Cohn. He was pretending to be Mr. Cohn because he knew the man apparently. And then Mr. Cohn would have asked the bank to send him the note back because he wouldn't believe that he ever wrote one when the bank asked him to repay his loan. And upon receiving the note, he would instantly see what had happened, that someone had forged a document in his name asking for a loan to the bank. Now, Ray Jackson may have asked Mr. Cohn to meet with him privately so he could give back the money, and then proceeded to murder Mr. Cohn. And subsequently, Ray Jackson bought about $3 worth of cattle right after Cohn disappeared. And we know that he sure didn't finance that purchase on a school teacher's salary. So do you understand what's happening here?
Yep.
Apparently, Ray Jackson potentially took a loan out in Cohn's name, then met Cohn, killed him.
That's the ultimate scam.
Yeah, and then bought $3,000 worth of cattle. Then this story doesn't end here. Just a few weeks after Mr. Cohn vanished, Ethel Martin, an 11-year-old schoolgirl, stayed late at the schoolhouse where Ray Jackson was the teacher. She's 11, she's a girl. A half an hour after arriving home that afternoon, she died of apparent poisoning. Her death was ruled accidental. There was some strychnine, I'm not sure how to, strychnine nearby, and it was believed she'd eaten some. It's some sort of a poison. It's very bitter. However, no 11-year-old would eat it on purpose. Moreover, it kills in hours, not minutes. So author Melanie Tupper argues it's more likely that this girl ate something laced with a more subtle poison, such as arsenic, at the schoolhouse, possibly after discovering something relating to Mr. Cohn's disappearance just a little bit earlier. And if Ray Jackson was the killer, he would probably have been stored there, meaning that if Ray Jackson was the killer, the author is arguing that Mr. Cohn was potentially stashed in the school for some reason. Now the story doesn't end there, so we potentially know that Ray Jackson also murdered an 11-year-old girl by poisoning her. The story doesn't end there. 3 years later, Julius Vandelli was a young homesteader just getting started, new to Silver Lake. There is no clear connection to Ray Jackson except for some spooky similarities to the Cohn disappearance/murder. Vandelli was shot to death, then the killer warehoused the body for 11 weeks before beating the face to unrecognizability and planting the body in the creek near where Mr. Cohn's body was found, artistically arranging it so it would freeze into the eyes face up. The killer then communicated prolifically to the press, writing an anonymous letter to the Portland Oregonian newspaper to help guide searchers to the body. And after a suspect was wrongly identified, another anonymous letter provided details of how to find the body. So the only connection here is that the modus operandi is very similar. Then we have 3 years after that, officially, Emma Dobkins died of angina pectoris in Lane County. However, Lane County residents said she committed suicide after a tainted relationship with Ray Jackson Van Buren, who was a great pal of her brother Frank. She may very well died naturally in giving childbirth because she was pregnant with Mr. Van Buren's child, believe it or not, at that point. However, angina pectoris, which is basically chest pain, is a strange thing to list as a cause of death, especially for a woman under 30. But the well-meaning people tried to protect her reputation afterwards by being vague on the documentation, so it's hard to know for sure how she died or what, if any, possible role Ray Jackson might have played in her death beyond having apparently gotten her pregnant. So this is what I mean about Ray Jackson being the angel of death. It's so kind of eerie and creepy how people just keep dying around him. You know, like people just keep dying in that area. But this is not where we end. Harold Bradley died in 1925. This happened 15 years after Emma Dobkins, the woman that Ray Jackson had impregnated, died. Bradley was a hired hand on the Lincoln Hutton's large and successful ranch. Just a rancher named Lincoln Hutton. He was shot twice while going with Hutton to work on a car in Hutton's ranch. Now, Link Hutton's wife, Leona, testified that after the first shot, she heard Harold Bradley yell, "Link, you've shot me." And Ray Jackson, believe it or not, was a neighbor to all of these events. He testified in a subsequent murder trial that Link came to his place and confessed to him that he had apparently murdered this guy Harold Bradley. Now, this is where things get really dark. There is some evidence that Ray Jackson and Leona Hutton were having an affair at the time. Some believe it was possible that Ray Jackson had planned to shoot Hutton and then frame Bradley, then move in with the widow Leona Hutton that he was having an affair with. However, Hutton and Bradley were built similarly, and there wasn't much light because it was the evening, and so perhaps the bullet was meant for Hutton, the ranch owner, but it hit the farmhand Bradley. By the way, Bradley's wounds were survivable when he was shot, but he did not survive them. You know why?
Why?
Because he was left alone with Ray Jackson for an hour after getting shot while the others went for help.
Oh, that's just
And he
wrong.
didn't survive.
Of course you wouldn't.
The angel of death. Ray Jackson, the angel of death. Then we have another person 5 years later. Ira Bradley was Harold Bradley's father, the same guy who died under the supervision of Ray Jackson, the angel of death. He was found beaten to death with the butt of a revolver at his ranch, 1.5 miles from Harney County line. Harney County is a county. He lived around a mile and a half from the county line. Now, his face too was beaten to unrecognizability. The killer planted evidence at the neighbor's house, but the neighbor had an alibi. He was in town buying a new Ford when it happened, so there was the killer tried to frame the neighbor. Luckily, another neighbor was actually in the area. This neighbor helpfully called the Harney County authorities, but he was apparently forgetting in which county he was living, because let's remember that the Harney County was a 1.5 miles away. So this neighbor called them, but he was supposed to call another county because he was in a different county at that time.
Yeah.
But maybe you live close to a county, you forget which county you live in, whatever, right? Anything can happen. So Harney County officers came, checked out the crime scene, loaded up the body and took it to Burns. Then it's apparently a town. Then discovered it was Lake County's case. In the ensuing confusion, much footprint evidence was lost, and the killer was never identified. But the thing about this case is that Ray Jackson Van Buren was that helpful second neighbor once more in this case.
Oh, that's just
the
weird.
angel of death, I'm telling you, the angel of death. Now, Ray Jackson was found dead in 1938 in an upstairs room in his house. He had apparently shot himself with a gun. Oddly enough, he chose to shoot himself in the chest, not the head, using a stove poker to actuate the trigger. he was 68 years old. So one particularly odd thing about this angel of death, Ray Jackson, his record of helpfulness is that this list covers a significant slice of all the murders and suspicious death cases in Lake County from 1899 to 1930. There were other cases, but this list hits the high points and then some. Each time there was some connection to Ray Jackson. Indeed, in most of them, Jackson was a central player, so the odds are pretty suspicious here. In her book, Tupper makes the case that Jackson was a sociopath and a serial killer in an age that most people didn't really know what either of those things were. She's probably right, he displayed some of the characteristics we associate with sociopaths. Glibness, absolute lack of social fear, impulse towards grandiosity, promiscuity. But you don't have to buy her argument about that to see that there was something funny and deadly about this particular man. He was an easy liar, a great actor and accomplished forger, and the serial embezzler, among other things. He was entrusted with the entire community's school children for a decade. He was the he was the teacher. It's pretty bizarre, right?
Yeah.
And at least one of them died under suspicious circumstances right after coming home from school. And nearly every time there was a brutal, suspicious homicide somewhere in Oregon's third largest county, he just happened to be on hand, helping out, giving advice, talking excitedly to the cops and the press. The angel of death, essentially.
Was he? Was he really
so.
the angel of death, or was he the killer?
I think he was the angel of death.
Okay.
He was bad news, essentially.
Bad news to be around.
Yeah. Okay, so generally, when we talk about the case, we have a pretty clear timeline here, or at least somewhat of a clear timeline. We have that in 1923, in the fall, the three men moved into the cabin. A week before Christmas, one of the men, Edward Nickols, visited the nearby city of Bend, Oregon. He was happy. Then January 15th, Alan Wilcoxon visited the cabin and left on January 16th, one day after. January 24th, we suspect that Charles Kimsey was asking for the directions of a fur dealer in Portland. Later that year in April, the men's bodies are found. 9 years later, Charles Kimsey was apprehended by police, but they didn't have enough evidence to tie him to the murder. So the timeline is pretty clear. We have burnt food in pots on the stove and the dining table set for a meal. The fox pen is empty. We do have a blood-stained claw hammer found in the corner of the pen. Potentially,
What is a claw hammer?
A claw hammer is basically a hammer, but it has those two little kind of claws. It's used to take out a nail from a piece of wood.
Yeah.
You know, like one side is used for smashing and the other one is for taking out nails. So a bloody claw hammer was found in the fox pen. Traps had been unattended to, indicating that the men have been missing for quite a while at the time when they were found. The sled was found near the shore of the lake. It had dark blood stains. There was a hole that had been cut on the edge of the lake. On the trail leading to the lake, there were pools of blood in the snow, clumps of hair, and human tooth found, so I assume some of the men have been pulled by their hair. Potentially, men had suffered gunshot wound injuries and blunt force trauma, and Edward Nickols still had his reading glasses on. So I think there is a potential that maybe the man got lured away, and maybe Edward Nickols was in the house when he got killed, but then at the same time there was no signs of a struggle inside of the house, so we can't really go with that theory either.
I think they were lured out of the house. It was quick.
I think so. I think there is a good potential that the men had been just lured out of the house.
Yeah.
potentially somehow one by one.
I'm surprised that the house didn't burn down. The bird food and all.
Exactly, that's also interesting. Do you think that there was one killer in this case, or do you suspect that there were maybe two killers, or maybe three, multiple killers?
I was thinking now too, actually. The angel of death, the way these men died, kind of sounds like the same way some of the other people died when you were talking about the angel of death.
Yeah, and believe it or not, the angel of death was an acquaintance of Charles. I think it was a proven thing that they maybe even had shared the friends between, like they had the common friends.
That's pretty bad. Bad news all over.
That's bad news. So if I had to kind of bet, I think my bet is pretty clear here. I'm definitely betting that Charles Kimsey is the murderer, and I don't have enough, I guess, information connecting the angel of death to this crime, but I would say that he is definitely a possible suspect.
Yeah, I think so too.
Right. Well, I think that's it. That's it for the Lava Lake murders. I think we won't have a definitive answer anytime soon, but I think we will be able to kind of just put this one away, put this case away, try to talk about some more cases, mystery stuff. So I hope everyone enjoyed, and we will catch you
Next time.
See you guys.
See ya.